I'm enjoying a little bit of coffee. This is pecan praline flavor, and it's very good. So I am going to do a video book review, and this book is called The Other Slavery by Andrés Reséndez, and he is a historian and professor at the University of California. And The Other Slavery is a book where he talks about the enslavement of Native Americans in the Western Hemisphere. So he details the accounts of primary sources, secondary sources, and he is going to attack the timeline between when the Spanish or Spaniards first arrived to present day, pretty much. And it is a very interesting read. The subtitle is The Uncovered Story of Indian Enslavement in America. And one thing I found interesting about this was that the flow of the story, but also the fact that most people don't think about Native Americans and the things that they went through as enslavement, right? When you think of slave, you think of mainly, if you're in the Western Hemisphere, you think of what African Americans, foundational Black Americans, people whose ancestry go back to Africa, but we don't necessarily think about the the people who land these words and who are already here, right? And so he does a great job on painting the picture of what these people went through. So um I wrote down a list of things that he talked about. It's about 5 pages. I'm just going to use this as a reference point because as I would read each chapter, I would summarize important parts. So in chapter 1, he talks about King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella in 1492, and that they signed the Capitulations of Santa Fe. And he talked about Christopher Columbus, who, when he realized that he would be sent to the New World and would be granted the permission to um, go on his voyage, one of the things that he decided that he wanted to do was he asked King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella to grant him honors, right? So he basically wanted them to give him a form of like a stock option to say like, okay, if my voyage is successful, then I want 1/3 of all of everything, and I want my name to be honored, and he wanted his children's name to go along with those honors, right? And so he wanted to he wanted a title that he could bequeath to his heirs, okay? And the author stated that he asked for 1/10 of all of the goods that were found, and he successfully returned in 1493, right? In chapter 2, he talks about Hernan Cortez. Of course, he introduces the encomienda system into the New World. And in this book, he talks about the encomienda system. He talks about in 1542, when Philip II comes into power in Spain, how he is going to enact the new laws. He's going to talk about the repartimiento systems, and then he's going to talk about the hacienda system, right? So if you are a person who studies Spanish history, these terms would not be new to you. But if you are new to studying Spanish history, then these terms may be new to you. Now, I don't speak Spanish. I'm a person who studies the Spanish language, but I'm not fluent. So if I mispronounce some of the Spanish names, bear with me, okay? So, Native Americans are being shipped from the New World to Spain and Europe. Native Americans in Spain will begin to find themselves in the courts, and they're going to start protesting their freedoms. Um, in the Spanish enslaving the Native Americans, they favored to enslave the women over the men. So it was like 2 to 1 compared to the African slave trade, which was going on simultaneously, right? It was 2 males to every 1 female, but in the Native American slavery, it was 2 females to every 1 male. So they would take these Native Americans and they would ship them to Spain and Europe and put them in servitude, and they were being sent there to be domestics. A lot of people don't know that Native Americans, soon as the Spanish came, was being sent to the New World. Most of the conquistadors, they fought in what's known as the Reconquista, the reconquering of the Iberian Peninsula from the Moors and the North Africans. So when the conquistadors started coming to the New World, they had already had a system put in place. They were already battle tested, and a lot of them were looking to increase their social status through war. Um, so a lot of these people had uh disdain for people who were not of the same ethnic background and religions as them, as well as people that were not practicing Catholics, because of the Inquisition and everything that was going on in Europe at the time, which is, you would go into the history of the Reformations and all of that type of stuff. But Europe at this time was going through a lot of turmoil because the English and in Italy and certain parts of Northern Europe, like Germany, they were turning away from the Catholic Church, right? And so you get the Church of England, you get things like Martin Luther, and in earlier times people like John Wycliffe. So these people were turning away from the Catholic Church and the Pope, and the Inquisition at this time was trying to keep a stronghold and to keep the control, keep allow the Catholic Church to keep control of the political system. So at this point in time, only the people who were Catholics were really allowed to come to the New World at this time, right? And this is going to have further consequences when we get into chapter 3. So he talks about how people that were of the Jewish faith were barred by the Catholic Church from coming to the New World. Okay, and this was because of the Inquisition. So a lot of the Muslims and the Jewish people were pushed out of Spain and sent to Africa. So, and out of just Spain in general, right? So Africans are being trafficked to the New World, and Native Americans are being trafficked from the New World to the Old World. And he follows 3 court cases in Spain from the people named Gaspar, Maria, and Beatriz, who sued for their freedom. And this was really unfair court cases because the Spaniards, they favored their own, and basically people that were not of their ethnic group could not win or have a fair trial, right? And then a lot of these people, like Gaspar, Maria, and Beatriz, who were Native Americans, they were taken really young, and so that they could not adequately say that where their place of origin was. And so in the courts, what the Spaniards would argue is that these people were captured by the Portuguese, or that they came from the Azores or the Cape Verde Islands, or they came from other places that was controlled by the Portuguese, and therefore they were not truly from the New World. And this was done to keep them in slavery. King Charles wanted to end slavery on the Native Americans, and he fought to end slavery, but it was still practiced. King Philip, the son of King Charles, created the repartimiento system, which was another version or an extension of the encomienda system. So basically, what that system was like was saying that, okay, you guys are forced to work for the Spaniards, but you are not slaves, right? But you're still forced to work, and they would be given clothes or food, but they were not actually given the autonomy to choose to be free. And uh he talks about since slavery was so ingrained in the system that the Spaniards created, when people wanted to end the slavery, even from the very beginning, or people like Bartolomé de las Casas who opposed the slavery, it made it very difficult for them to end because people that were in the high courts were benefiting from the system. And this is going to go on for hundreds of years, right? He's going to talk about the Mixing War, which is fought by the Native Americans to end slavery. He talks about that the slaves were given brands on their face and to signify that they were in servitude. And I found that that was very interesting. The Spaniards claimed that the Indians practiced slavery before the Europeans arrived. The Bartholomew de las Casas wanted to end slavery, but did not have the power to enforce it. But he wrote a book at the time that's still in circulation today, where he details the horrors that the Native Americans went through, and that what Bartholomew de las Casas was arguing that the Spaniards should enslave the Africans instead of the Indians. And at the same time, the Indians were being depleted due to smallpox and other diseases that was ravaging through the Native Americans. Now, first they take over central Mexico, right? The Aztecs. And then later on, they're going to start spreading to Peru, Colombia, and Venezuela. So it was it was a decentralized campaign. It wasn't just like, you know, they took over the whole landmass, is which the story is talking about. So the Spaniards were taking parts of the New World piece by piece. And it was the Portuguese on one side and the Spaniards on one side, at first collectively colonizing and Christianizing the natives. In chapter 3, he talks about Luis de Carvajal, who becomes a governor of Nuevo Leon in Mexico. And so this figure is a figure who he starts off as a boy of Jewish descent, right? And he is living in Spain, between the borders of Portugal and Spain. And since he was young enough, his family decided that since the Inquisition was very real, that they would go to Portugal where it was safer, and he would be sent to Spain to be basically Christianized. And so he goes to Spain, and he studies Spanish, and he becomes fluent. He becomes a practicing Catholic. And then at the age of 15, he goes to work for his uncle of the same name, and his uncle is in the business of the slave trade. So his uncle is going to be working with the Portuguese. Now at the time, the Portuguese owned the slave ports. The Spaniards did not own the slave ports. So um the Cape Verde Islands are going to be a launching pad for Europeans sending slaves to the New World. And so he ends up going to these places, and that's where he begins to learn about the slave trade. And later on in the story, after gaining wealth from the African slave trade, he's going to come to the New World. And when he sees the Native Americans, he sees it as an opportunity to just continue building his wealth and doing what he had already been doing off the coast of Africa. So that's chapter 3. The story ends with basically him doing things such as telling Native Americans that they were going to baptize them and then later enslaving them. Now, this is going to bring him into conflict with people who despise him, and he's going to have a pretty lengthy political career. But um, what ends up happening to Luis de Carvajal is that when he's going to send for his family, his nieces, his nephews, who are still practicing um the Jewish faith. And what's going to happen is the Mexican Inquisition are going to find out that they are called new Christians, or crypto Jews, or crypto Christians, which basically means that they are practicing Judaism in secret. And the Spanish Inquisition is going to torture his niece. They're going to torture his nephew, and then they're going to eventually execute them by burning them at the stake. Due to his high status, he is not going to um perish, but he's going to get exiled from the new world, right? And so I found that story was ironic, because here he was enslaving Native Americans and Africans, and the same people that he had been working for is later going to execute his whole family. Okay. And so in 1631, silver is found. So this is going to bring a whole new explosion into Mexico. So we know about the boom where the California gold rush. He's going to talk about the silver trade, and how silver is found, and so much silver is mined in Mexico that is going to create millionaires, and is also going to bring in a lot of traffic. The Native Americans and Africans are going to be forced to work in the silver mines. And as a result, this is going to have far-reaching consequences, because like I stated, that they are going to be put on the bottom of the costa, and going to be forced to work in these silver mines. And the silver mines, they had these metals and this mercury that would get into the lungs of the workers, and would cause premature death or very serious illness. And they were forced to work for their overlords. So Indians, blacks, and mulattoes were forced to work. Some of these people would be semi-paid in a way where they would be given a share of the spoils, but that was counterproductive, because if they that the people at the top of the cast will look at it and say, well, if I have to pay this person and they are the ones doing all of the work, then they're going to keep most of the silver for themselves. So, in the middle of the book, we get into Charles the Fourth and Sor Maria's, and they tried to amend slavery in Chile, Mexico, and they tried to end slavery. But like I stated, slavery at this point is so wrapped up in their system. At the same time, people from the Philippines are going to start being shipped to the New World to work in these silver mines, and this is going to bring into a huge influx of people from Asia into Mexico, into the Americas. Okay, so many Native Americans thought that if they converted to Catholicism, that they would not be slaves. But even after generations of attempting to convert to Catholicism, they were still being enslaved. And so the Spaniards they kept amending the slavery on paper, but in practice, the experience would still go on. And this is going to go on in through the next couple centuries. Um, Chapter 6, he gets into how when silver is going to be found in the Mexican state of Chihuahua. So when silver is found in Chihuahua, is going to have far-reaching consequences for New Mexicans and the border states. So people from New Mexico are going to start, the Native Americans there are going to start being enslaved, the Comanches, and uh, they're going to be sent to Chihuahua to work as slaves. Later on, the Comanches are going to start enslaving the Mexicans um years later. And so he talks a lot about how the introduction of the horse is going to have far-reaching consequences as well as the gun, because as the Indians like the Navajos and the Comanches, they're first going to come into contact with the Europeans. First they're going to be combative, and then later on they're going to start having trade with the Europeans. And the Native Americans who trade with the Europeans first are going to get weapons and horses, and then they're going to start using it against the Native Americans who don't have access to these goods. And he talks a lot about how the Native Americans known as the Paiutes in western the western United States, these people are going to fall victim to the Comanches and the Navajos, because they they did not use the horse, and they were agriculturalists, and they were nomadic. And so the other Native Americans who have horses are going to start enslaving the Native Americans who don't have horses and who are not able to adequately defend themselves because they don't even have firearms at this point. He talks about the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, which was a pivotal event when the Native Americans are going to push the Spaniards and the New Mexicans out of New Mexico, right? And they're going to keep them out for 12 years. He talked about the powerful nomads, as I mentioned, who are going to get the Apaches, Navajos, Comanches. They're going to become the premier Indian enslavers, and they're going to sell the Indians to the Europeans to work in the mines, and they're going to sell them to get access to the land, sheep's, their cattle. Just it so it's going to spark about 250 years of internal conflict, because the people who get goods from the Europeans are going to turn around and use those weapons of war against other Native Americans. Then he's going to start talking about California a lot, with the missions, the presidios and slaves, the islands off the coast of California, and how the Seri people, who are a group of Native Americans, they're going to resist the Spaniards for a very long time. And then the presidios are like prisons or work camps where they the Native Americans, that is, are forced to work on these camps. And at first they tried to live side by side with the Europeans, but the Europeans and the Spaniards and the Mestitos, the people that was mixed with the Europeans, I'm considering them as the Europeans too, because they no longer they were Hispanicized, so they didn't see themselves as the Native Americans. So the Native Americans who are converted to Catholicism and then start living on the presidios, they're going to face a form of enslavement. So it was multifaceted, where the Native Americans who attempted to convert to Catholicism, they were still not seen as Peninsulares or the people from Spain, but they still viewed themselves as a higher class than the Native Americans who didn't convert. The Seri people are going to go through a lot of tragedies, um, because they are going to try to live on the isla of Tuberon off the coast of California. They're going to be sent to Los Angeles, and they're going to be enslaved. And many of them in the 1780s, they're going to die of yellow fever, smallpox, and other illnesses. Thousands of Native Americans are killed. They're going to start an all out war. The Europeans start an all out enslavement of these people, and putting them all together like this and trafficking them is going to lead to disease. And so thousands of them end up dying. Okay, so as we're going into the 1800s, a new form of bondage is going to be used, and this is going to be debt bondage, where uh, the Comanches are now 100 years later going to start enslaving the Mexicans and selling them uh, for for other goods. So, on the account of journalist John Kenneth Turner, he visits the Yucatan, and he is going to pretend to be a wealthy investor, and he's going to basically witness that slavery is still existing and is existing under another name. And he has a very detailed account. He was mentioned in one of my other books that I read on this topic, John Kenneth Tanner. So in wrapping up in chapter 10, he talks about the Americans and the other slavery, and then he goes into how uh the Americans moving out west are going to displace more Native Americans. You know, the westward expansion is going to displace hundreds of thousands of Native Americans. The Canyon de Chile was a stronghold of the Navajo and the focus points of the chapters 10 through 12. The Navajos are going to go through an extremely difficult period in the 19th century, the 1800s. The Navajos are going to face wars from all directions. Okay, so the the New Mexicans are going to go to war with the Navajos. The the other Indian tribes are going to go to war with the Navajos, and the United States military are going to go to war with the Navajos, and it ends with the Navajos being placed on the reservation, right? And that was a very sad story to read about what happened to the Navajos. So um in Northern California, the Indians are going to be held as servants, as I was alluding to in the previous chapter with the series, and the Apaches and the other natives. They're going to be held to work on ranchos. It's going to talk about Salvador Vallejo, who owned Rancho Patulima. It's going to talk about Sacramento, Napa Valley, and the surrounding areas being colonized by the Americans. He's going to talk about how Native American men and women were often just shot and killed and tortured. He's going to bring up John Billwell, who is a notable figure, and Clear Lake, which was once home to the Native Americans, were going to be colonized by the Europeans. And lastly, he talks about the Indian Act of 1850, which were a set of laws put in place to further subjugate the Indians of the West. So in chapter 11, he talks about California and the need for Indian labor. The Mormons and Brigham Young believed that slavery was a natural part of the human experience. He argued that Eve accepted slavery by not listening to God and eating the forbidden fruit. Adam goes in to become agreed to slavery because he's going to eat of the forbidden fruit. Brigham Young and the Mormons and his son-in-law Charles Decker are going to start trading the with the Native Americans and capturing slaves. He talks about the trial of Leon Lujan, and basically it was a New Mexican who is going to trying to bring slavery into Utah. But the way the story reads is like the Mormons wanted to control the slave trade of Utah. And lastly, he talks about the Civil War and the 13th Amendment, and how in the final chapter that the 13th Amendment and the Civil War is going to bring the Navajos to the Bosque Redondo Reservation, and